1. The Emperor, Tenno, sacred authority without real power. In medieval Japanese society, the emperor held the highest position in name, but possessed almost no real political power. The emperor was believed to be a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, which made him sacred and inviolable, a symbol of legitimacy and cosmic order. However, from the 12th century onward, actual political authority gradually fell entirely into the hands of the warrior class. The emperor lived mainly in the imperial palace in Kyoto, performing traditional rituals such as ceremonies for heaven and earth, granting symbolic titles, and formally legitimizing the authority of the shogun. Every military regime required imperial recognition to justify its rule. Therefore, even without an army, taxation power, or legislative authority, the emperor remained the ultimate source of legitimacy. In daily life, the emperor often lived in financial hardship, dependent on stipends provided by the shogunate. In some periods, the imperial family was nearly impoverished and had to sell treasures to survive. Nevertheless, the emperor's spiritual position was never erased, because in Japanese consciousness, the emperor was not merely a human ruler, but the embodiment of the nation itself. What is remarkable is that despite being stripped of real power for centuries, the imperial institution was never overthrown, unlike monarchies in the West. This continuity later allowed Japan to transition into a modern state without the need for a revolution to abolish the monarchy. 2. The shogun, the true military dictator. The shogun was the holder of real power in medieval Japan. The title originally meant great general who subdues the barbarians, but gradually became the supreme leadership position of the country. The shogun stood at the head of the military government, bakufu, commanding the army, collecting taxes, appointing officials, and controlling the daimyo. Unlike the emperor, who was symbolic, the shogun decided matters of war and peace, laws, and the fate of the nation. From Minamoto Yoritomo in 1192 onward, Japan officially entered a military age, where physical force replaced bloodline as the foundation of political power. The shogun lived mainly in the imperial palace in Kyoto, performing traditional rituals such as ceremonies for heaven and earth, granting symbolic titles, and formally legitimizing the authority of the shogun. Unlike the emperor, who was symbolic, the shogun decided matters of war and peace, laws, and the fate of the nation. From Minamoto Yoritomo in 1192 onward, Japan officially entered a military age where physical force replaced bloodline as the foundation of political power. The shogun rarely governed provinces directly, instead ruling through the daimyo. This relationship was both master-servant and political alliance. When the shogun was strong, the country was stable. When the shogun was weak, the daimyo rebelled and Japan descended into civil war, as seen during the Sengoku period. Notably, the shogun was not a king, yet possessed more power than a king. This created a rare political structure, a nation with a sacred emperor but governed entirely by a military strongman. 3. The daimyo, feudal mini-kingdoms. The daimyo were regional lords who controlled vast territories, maintained private armies, enforced their own laws, and operated independent tax systems. In practice, each daimyo functioned like a small king. They built castles, expanded military forces, supported samurai, and expanded territory through warfare. In theory, daimyo were loyal to the shogun, but during the Sengoku period, 1467 to 1600, the shogunate lost control and the daimyo fought endlessly for dominance. Japan became a continuous battlefield for more than a century. Within their domains, daimyo held absolute power over life and death. They could execute peasants, punish samurai, grant land, and award titles. Every aspect of civilian life depended on them, from taxation to justice. Competition among the daimyo created a society that was dynamic but brutally violent. At the same time, this environment produced the great unifiers of Japan, such as Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. 4. The samurai, the ruling class of the sword. Samurai were not merely sword-bearing warriors, but the backbone of power in medieval Japan. For nearly 700 years, from the Kamakura period through Muromachi and Sengoku, samurai controlled the military, the legal system, and social order. They did not serve an abstract state, but pledged loyalty to individual lords, daimyo or shogun. This personal loyalty created a uniquely Japanese power structure based not on constitutions or legal institutions, but on organized violence and allegiance. Legally, samurai enjoyed extraordinary privileges. They had the right to carry weapons, were exempt from many taxes, and in many periods could legally kill commoners for perceived insults, kirisute gomen. This produced a society where the law was unequal and human life depended directly on social rank. Samurai were both enforcers of law and figures above the law. Samurai life revolved around Bushidō, the way of the warrior. It was not a written legal code, but a moral system emphasizing absolute loyalty, courage, self-control, contempt for death, and devotion to honor. Honor was not abstract, it was social capital. A samurai who lost honor lost status, income, and identity. Thus, seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment, was seen as the only way to restore one's human value.
5. Peasants, the exploited foundation of feudal Japan. In medieval Japan, peasants formed the largest and most economically vital class. They produced rice, which was not only food, but the unit of wealth and power. All income of daimyo and samurai was measured in rice, and all war budgets depended on harvests. In other words, the entire feudal system survived on peasant labor. The great paradox was that despite sustaining society, peasants lived under severe oppression. They paid extremely high taxes, often 40 to 70% of their output. Taxes were not only paid in rice, but also in forced labor, building castles, roads, and transporting supplies. During wars, many peasants were conscripted as porters, leaving fields abandoned and worsening famine. Peasants were tightly bound to their villages. They could not leave freely, could not carry weapons, and had almost no legal rights. In conflicts with samurai, peasants always lost. In many periods, samurai could kill peasants for perceived disrespect without trial. Yet peasants did not remain entirely passive. Japanese history records many peasant uprisings called ikki, triggered by excessive taxation or brutal lords. These revolts were spontaneous, poorly armed, and usually crushed, but they revealed deep class tension beneath the surface of obedience. Ideologically, peasants ranked higher than artisans and merchants. Confucian thought viewed them as producers of real value, while others merely depended on them. Thus, even in poverty, peasants were considered the moral foundation of society. 6. Artisans, builders of the material world. Artisans produced all material foundations of Japan: swords, armor, bows, houses, bridges, pottery, and tools. Without them, samurai could not fight, daimyo could not build castles, and civilians could not survive. Yet artisans ranked low socially, below peasants, because they did not produce food. Traditional ideology viewed them as merely transforming materials, not creating value from nature. Their technical skill could be extraordinary, but their moral status remained low. Artisans lived in guilds and passed skills through families. Some swordsmith lineages became legendary, creating katana considered national treasures. But no matter their mastery, artisans could never rise to samurai status. Their livelihoods depended entirely on elite demand. War meant weapon production, peace meant unemployment or domestic crafts. They had no political rights, no voice in governance, and little social prestige. Ironically, artisans created much of Japan's cultural identity: wooden architecture, tea ceremony pottery, armor aesthetics, sword craftsmanship. They shaped Japan's physical form, but were never fully recognized. 7. Merchants, wealth without respect. In medieval Japanese society, merchants occupied a deeply paradoxical position. They could accumulate enormous wealth, control the flow of goods and money, and shape economic life, yet they stood near the bottom of the social hierarchy. According to Confucian ideology, merchants were viewed as parasitic because they did not directly produce food or essential materials, but instead profited by buying cheaply and selling at higher prices. As a result, no matter how rich they became, merchants were considered morally inferior. Politically, merchants possessed almost no formal power. They were excluded from government, barred from administrative positions, and forbidden from participating in political decision-making. Feudal Japanese society placed authority in the hands of the warrior class, while money was seen as secondary to honor and loyalty. Within this logic, merchants were people who had wealth but lacked legitimacy. However, economic reality gradually moved in the opposite direction. From the late Muromachi period, and especially towards the end of the Sengoku era, commerce expanded rapidly. Cities such as Osaka, Sakai, and Edo became major commercial centers where merchants controlled the circulation of rice, salt, textiles, metals, and weapons. In practice, they were the ones who held real financial power. Meanwhile, many samurai lived on fixed stipends paid in rice, which made them economically inflexible. When prices fluctuated, when wars ended, and when plunder disappeared, samurai increasingly fell into debt. They were forced to borrow money from merchants, the very people they socially despised. This created a profound contradiction. Those who were culturally despised became the creditors of the ruling class. In an attempt to preserve the old order, successive shogunates issued laws restricting merchants, banning luxury consumption, limiting clothing, prohibiting large houses, and discouraging displays of wealth. But these regulations were largely symbolic. In reality, samurai grew more dependent on merchants to maintain their lifestyles, pay retainers, and even purchase weapons. Some merchants cleverly used their wealth to gain indirect influence. They financed daimyo, provided high-interest loans to samurai, and controlled food distribution networks. Although they lacked official authority, they possessed informal power, the power of capital. This type of power was particularly dangerous to the feudal system because it undermined military authority from within. In the long run, the rise of the merchant class destabilized the fundamental logic of Japanese feudal society, that honor outweighed money and that the sword mattered more than gold. Once economic capital became the true source of power, a system based on hereditary warriors and military dominance could no longer remain stable. Merchants, once despised and marginalized, became the silent architects of Japan's transition towards a modern, economically driven society. 8. Eita and Hinin, the excluded humans. At the very bottom were Eita and Hinin, people considered impure and unworthy of social inclusion. They worked in unclean occupations, slaughtering animals, executing criminals, handling corpses, tanning leather, cleaning battlefields. In Buddhist and Shinto thought, death and blood were spiritually polluting. Those who dealt with them were considered contaminated, even though their work was necessary. This created religious and cultural discrimination, not just economic exclusion. Eita and Hinin lived in segregated communities, could not marry outside their group, could not change occupations, and passed stigma to their children. They lacked legal protection and were often abused.